Then we can start. So good morning. Today we're going to go to the land of Normandy. And as you know, it's a varied landscape because it has a shore, which is always nice. You have the North Sea and also rolling hills. It doesn't have any spectacular heights, not big relief. This is, as you will see on one of the maps, it's a rather gentle terrain, but then you have the beauty of the shores of the North Sea. And then, of course, lots of churches. What you see here is the Mont St-Michel that we will see in more details later on. So Normandy is made of 5 departments. The Manche that you see here, the Manche is actually what the British call the English Channel. I always insist it's not English, it's the Channel. So in French they call it La Manche. Calvados, the Orne, Eure, and Seine-Maritime. Here's the map, a physical map, and there you can see that there's definitely, this is a rather gentle terrain. And I've circled in yellow the most important points that we're going to look at. Of course, Rouen, Caen are the 2 main cities, particularly for some of the monuments that you can see, still see in there. Just for Giverny, I didn't put it on, but it's southwest of Gisors, and we will look at Giverny towards the end of the presentation. As in most of European countries, you have a lot of prehistoric monuments, remnants of prehistoric monuments, and this one is on the Ile Chaussée, west of the peninsula of the west of Normandy, and this is what we call a cromlech, and the cromlech is a circular setting of stones, just like Stonehenge, if you want. This one is about 13 meters in diameter, so 39, almost 40 feet in diameter. And this is in a place, what you call the intertidal location, which means it's in between the high tide and the low tide. So during the high tide, it's covered by water. Though at the time it was built, this was not the case. The level of the waters of the sea have changed dramatically since the moment when these stones were erected. Other buildings that you can find in different places are some tombs. So the Neolithic, in this case, the Neolithic Tumulus of Colombier-sur-Seulles. This dates back to 4500 to 4000 before our era. And this, of course, you can still have traces of the tumulus, but this would have been covered by some large stones and then covered by rubbles and other stones. These were taken away with the time and actually discovered that kind of burial room. This one, by the way, is the only one that has been discovered in Low Normandy. It is rather large. It measures, the whole tomb, of course, measures about 60 meters in length. So that's 180 feet by 30 feet in width. So you used to have an access to the burial chamber, which is that kind of a tholos, equivalent of the tholos in Greece. In some of the tombs that they've discovered, they found some very beautiful artifacts. These were actually left by Gaulish tribes, the Belgaes and the Celts that invaded Normandy. from the 4th to the 3rd century. As you can see on the upper left, the Gallic helmet made of bronze, iron, gold, and enamel. A very beautiful work dating back to the 4th century BCE. The Chariot Burial, you have an idea of the kind of artifacts that were found in that tomb. So this was again the burial. So it's a ceremonial burial. You have some beautiful jewelry and some pottery. And then some potteries that have been found in that necropolis in Etterville. So again, very beautiful pieces that really show and are the testimony of a pretty advanced culture. In 57 BCE, the Gauls united under Vercingetorix in attempt to resist the arrival of Caesar and his troops. But they were fortunately or unfortunately defeated in Alesia, in Burgundy. And so in 51 BC, Caesar was able to complete his conquest of Gaul and then establish a whole series of cities, very typically well organized as all the Roman cities in a grid fashion, and then you would have beautiful villas around. This is an example in Vieux-la-Romaine of what is left of a villa. So you would have the central atrium and then all the rooms around it. In this case, you even had a heating, central heating, which is called the hypocaust, where you would have heating here and the hot air would warm up the ground above, and sometimes even the walls, if they had pipes in the wall. They were very advanced devices. Here at the same place, you have a view of the excavation of the forum. Definitely you had a temple, and then you had some other temples and probably a basilica. Maybe a thermes, the terms, that's possible. The theater still in the same place, so a Gallo-Roman theater. So this really at that time conjugated both the Gallic and the Roman cultures, and then remarkable mosaics. This one with the themes of Orpheus, and that is now has been set into a museum to protect it, but you can see the quality of it, and immediately you know the cost. So this was a very affluent neighborhood, if you want. Statues of Jupiter on the left. Another god could be Apollo, found in Lillebonne also, with a beautiful head, definitely inspired by Greek models. But in the late 3rd century, some barbarian raids devastated Normandy, and it can be found by traces of fire and the fact that a lot of treasures were buried hastily. And so we know that at that time they were protecting their goods. They were raids from on the coast by Saxon pirates. They were a population coming from the east. And so this really changed the look of these settlements. Finally, as a result of Diocletian's reforms, Normandy, that was part of the same territory as Brittany, it was at that time detached, though they both remained depending on Lyon, so of Gallia Lugdunensis. In 457, the Aegidius just established the domain of Soissons. So this is covering part of the Normandy territory and also actually part of the Ile-de-France. There were some invasions of by Germanic tribes, and this actually really went against the power of the Romans. And so the Romans started moving back. Don't forget, at that time, Rome was in trouble too. So when the Franks, that were also population coming from the east, finally invaded the whole of France, except for Brittany, as you can see, Brittany being here, they formed different regions. So you had the Aquitaine, Neustria, which includes Normandy and the upper part of the Loire Valley. You had Alemannia, Bavaria, so these remain pretty much the same names, Austrasia and Burgundy. An important king of the Franks came about, and he's Clovis. And Clovis is really important because he's the first one that got openly converted to Christianity. And of course, everybody had to follow. But this is really going to change the face of France at that time. Christianization came little by little, but mostly because of the founding of monasteries, and extremely large monasteries. They became really the beginning of what would then expand as a village. But these monasteries were a center not only for culture, definitely for the cult, for religion, but also for knowledge. And they taught a lot to people that were living around. So here you see the standard organization of the monastery with the church, and then you have cloisters and the inhabitation for the monks. But you also would have side chapels for people visiting. You had typically kind of a hostel for people that were visiting. You had the infirmary for people that were sick. You had beautiful gardens, but that were not leisure gardens. They were planted with medical plants as well as with vegetables for food. You had orchards, typically orchards with the symmetry around. And so this is the kind of plan that you find again and again. The Abbey Saint-Wandry, that used to be called the Abbey of Fontenelle, is shown here on the 17th century engraving, but went through a lot of problems during, of course, the invasion of the Vikings. They knew that there was always a lot of treasures there, so would unfortunately be pretty ruthless and often demolished. But then they were not the only one. About 400 years later, you had the wars of religion when the Huguenots went against the Catholics and did a lot of damage. And then, of course, to cap the whole thing, the French Revolution in 1789 was also very damaging for anything that had to do with religion or money. So that particular abbey was part of a network of abbey at the time under the Benedictine rule. It possessed some great quantity of land, not only around Normandy, but throughout France. And this would be, of course, part of their income. It is still nowadays a Benedictine abbey. Unfortunately, the beautiful church that you can see here was demolished during the French Revolution, but you still have the 17th century beautiful buildings that of course replaced earlier, and these are still in use. Other monasteries, and you can see again similar plan. This is the Abbey of Jumiez. Also, unfortunately, the church went through terrible times with all these invasions of the Vikings, the war of religion, as well as the French Revolution. But this was one of these marvelous abbey that really was so responsible for the growth of the village around them. They often were a very large center of learning. And in this case, this abbey reached the zenith of its fame during the 11th century and was regarded as a model for all the monasteries of the province. Just to give, again, it's a refresher course on the invasions of the 9th century. Here is a map that shows you, in fact, two kinds of invasion, mostly the Viking with all the yellow arrows and lines that you find here. Vikings that were coming either from Norway, Sweden, or Denmark. So the Norwegian Vikings typically went to the northern of Britain, went to Iceland and Greenland in 982, but also went around Ireland and were known. They unfortunately completely demolished some of the great monasteries that were on the coast, like Lindisfarne in 793, but they also went in the Sea of Ireland and went always attacking the coast. They went then down, came to close to Bordeaux and attacked there, went all around Spain, came back through the Pyrenees, and then went to the southern coast of France and all the way to Italy. The Scandinavian then were more known to go east and are responsible for establishing a whole series of commercial posts in what is now Russia. And actually, many of the cities that are along that route bear some names that go back to the Swedes. And of course, the Danes, we're more familiar with them, are the one that engaged with the southern part of England and then literally came all the way to north, invade through the Loire, as I think I mentioned earlier, but also finally will settle in what is Normandy now, and Normandy, it's Northmen. This is where it takes its name. Now in red is something that we talk less about. It was in the early 10th century, the Magyar from Hungary invaded part of Europe. But that wasn't successful. It was finally pushed back at the end of the 10th century. So finally, what we see is the way all these invasions settled. And we have in the 8th century, we have the fact that these Scandinavian settlements in the 9th century in red. In orange in the 10th century, we have Greenland, we have Iceland that was already partly settled in the 9th century. And then in the end of the 11th century, we have them coming and being literally, we'll see, given part of the territory so they would leave people in peace because they were getting aggressive at times and really would demolish lots of things. So finally, in 911, that region, which is, you see here the lines are for the Normandy, the Duchy of Normandy, the region that you see here in with these orange lines or yellow lines is the region that was kind of given to one of the Vikings, Roland, named Roland, in 911. And this is how they established themselves there. And little by little moved a little further, but we're doing it rather peacefully, and finally really established a dynasty there that we know as the Dukes of Normandy. They even acquired some territories in 1050. So just to give you an idea, we talked about Roland. Here's the statue of Rollo on the left, who was the first Duke of Normandy, who lived there between 911 and 942. His dynasty goes down with Guillaume I, William I, long sword, Richard I, Richard II, and Richard II, who is the first one who openly called himself Duke of Normandy. He is the grandfather of William the Conqueror, who, of course, conquered England in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings. Here on the right is the statue of William the Conqueror in Falaise. Rollo apparently had an outstanding personality and was really able, thanks to his intelligence and to secure permanent foothold on the Frankish soil. And as I say, was literally given some territory so that he would leave people alone, because they went all the way to Paris and really made a mess down there. Here's the tombstone of Rollo in the Juan Cathedral, the reclined figure. A lot of the deeds of Rollo are written in the book of his he's here giving the book that relates to his life by ways. And so they don't really give an idea of historical event, but a lot that mentions his character and his life, event of his life. Of course, what relates to Normandy and the famous invasion of the southern part of England by William the Conqueror is related in the famous Bayeux tapestry. And by the way, it is not a tapestry at all. It's actually what you call a crewel embroidered hanging. So it is embroidered and not woven, but it has always had that name. And so people keep on talking about it. This tapestry is 230 feet long and 20 inches high. It has been moved some years ago to the center, Guillaume le Conquérant in Bayeux, to be better displayed and in a better environment, because this is so old and any textile is fragile and therefore needs to stay within a decent light, not too strong, but also have the proper temperature and humidity around. So you have here a sense of what it looks. And if you put Bayeux tapestry on the net, there are some marvelous comprehensive sites that show you the entire tapestry. Early on, it was exhibited in the Bayeux Cathedral in 476, we know by the inventory. But there's been a lot of speculation on the origin and where it was made particularly. It is true, as you can see, there are some sentences written on it. And it is it is in Latin, and it is through the kind of Latin that was used that they now certain it was actually made in England, probably by English nuns, because the Latin dialect they were using is proper to that region. Early on, they thought it was the wife of William the Conqueror, Matilda, that had done that with her ladies in waiting. But as I mentioned now, they're pretty sure it was made in England. Also, they can trace the vegetable dyes that were used to plants that are in the region of southern England. Within the tapestry, as we call it that way, we can count 626 humans, 731 animals, 376 boats, and 70 buildings and trees. And it shows, of course, definitely the whole history from the time William the Conqueror leaves the French coast to the moment of his victory. Here is a detail, and you can see very well how it was embroidered. This shows the Bishop Odo with the mace. Look at the detail of the stitches. It's remarkably expressionist if you look at the head of the horse. Even on that tapestry, it shows here William and Harold at Mont St-Michel. And this takes me to the Mont St-Michel, that extraordinary abbey church and the whole abbey around it that is built on that hill that is almost an island. Again, it is an intertidal location. So when you visit, if you go at low tide, you can walk to it. But be very careful, because the tide is known to be extremely fast, literally the speed of a running horse, galloping horse. So if you caught when the tide goes up, you could die, and many people have, unfortunately. So they were also quicksands, as you can see. I love these details that they show at the bottom and the top of the tapestry, which little details of animals and dragons, and you have almost the feeling to see some dinosaurs and fish, all this. It's extraordinary. So here are some little mock-ups that you can see in the museum in the Mont Saint-Michel, showing how the abbey started in the 10th century, a very modest little building. Then by the 11th and 12th century, the church was built. It is a very large size church. And now all the buildings around, which are the living in facilities for the monks, as well as for some visitors. And then by the 19th and 21st century, we know that it was restored. And sometimes in a fantasist way, as often with restoration. Here is the Mont Saint-Michel Abbey, and you can see the sea at the horizon. They now build a road that is high enough that it is not covered by the tide, but it has that extraordinary location when you come in, that it's isolated, its own island. Originally, it's supposed to have been founded by an Irish hermit. And very quickly, he gathered people from the community to join him. It was known as a stronghold for Gallo Roman culture at the time, but was ransacked, as all these places were. Not only by the Franks, but then later on by the Vikings, very vulnerable there. And suffered during the War of Religion as well as the French Revolution. Here's a close-up. And then an idea on how it's built. So you have the hill, and then the way the buildings around are built on the hill, with very large rooms that were rooms where they would store food as well as other necessities. In the cloister, the St. Peter Church, and a Gothic church. So this is obviously a church that replaced an earlier Romanesque church. You can see that actually the nave is still of Romanesque style. It's the apse that was later rebuilt in Gothic style. The cloister is beautiful. Always these very calm and silent places. As I mentioned, Normandy is a place of rolling hills, and I'm showing you just a few images that show you a lot of agriculture. This is obviously corn, but there are diverse grains that are grown here. And of course, a lot also of cattle. It is divided by different rivers. Here is the River Seine in Les Andelys with some cliffs. There seem to be choke cliffs also. And beautiful little rivers that cross different towns. The most important city is Rouen. Here's an old map of Rouen. It comes from the Celtic Hatumagos, sorry, in Latin, was transformed in Rotomagos and ended up Rouen. Don't ask me how, but this is the way language goes. It's actually the second commune of Normandy after Le Havre, the big harbor. It has a little over 110,000 inhabitants. It is definitely a city of churches, and you can see in that old map the number of steeples that come out of the roof line of the city. And of course, great commerce with rivers passing by and allowing the ships to unload their goods. For those of you that know a little bit of French culture, that was the city of Pierre Corneille, Théodore Géricault, Gustave Flaubert, and Marcel Duchamp. So here's now a modern view of the city. And to position, just give you some date, this is the 100-Year War. And Rouen, as you know, was a very important place for Joan of Arc. So here's when Joan of Arc comes and is a very decisive existence of a young girl like this that really was instrumental in the end of that 100-Year War. And so this is about the date where she was there. As you know, she died at age 19, so she had a very short lifetime. That terrible war, this is actually the second 100-Year War that was so much having faced, the French facing the British for the succession of the throne of France. In Rouen, you can find the Rouen, the keep of the Rouen Castle that is now known as the Tour Jeanne d'Arc, When she was captured by the Burgundian at the siege of Compiègne in 1430, they transferred her to the English, who organized the trial, as you know, headed by Pierre Cochon, who was Bishop of Beauvais. And Joan was convicted and then burned at the stake on the 30th of May, 1431. And it was in Rouen, and it was supposedly in that keep that they kept her prisoner for some time. The Justice Palace in Rouen is absolutely beautiful and still bears the bullets, you know, the marks of the bullets during the end of the Second World War. It is the largest civil Gothic edifice in France. It was constructed towards the end of the Middle Age on what used to be the Jewish quarter of the city. It was destroyed after the expulsion of the Jews in 1306, and then the new Justice Palace was built there. It started the construction in, as you can see, 1320, but then the major part was in 1499. It had a very important role. It was housing the exchequer of Normandy, the high judicial and financial court. And then in 1515, it was converted to the Parliament of Normandy. Here is the very large room that was called la salle des procureurs. So these were the most important the most important lawyers, the whole people that were representing the city. And so it was the court, literally the room where the court would gather. Extraordinary room and extraordinary ceiling. Under the Palace of Justice, you can still find some of the remnants of these Jewish buildings that were demolished when the Jews were expelled. And so you still have the southern entrance of the ancient yeshiva, the Maison Sublime, the Sublime House. This was only discovered in 1976, by the way. The most important building, religious building in Rouen is, of course, the Rouen Cathedral, mostly known for many of you through the paintings of Monet, but is a spectacular church. The buildings, of course, that preceded the 11th century were perished all during the Vikings invasions. And so it is actually in the previous church that Rollo was baptized and converted to Catholicism. And it is his grandson, Richard I, that decided to start the building, but it took a long time. So in 1030, they started building this church, and then it took a long time, as you can see, until 1880 for the last restorations, of course. But the first building was consecrated in 1065. And the cathedral was struck by lightning in 1110, as it happens very often because it's so high. So all these churches go through fires. Here is another view of the cathedral, and you have the plan of the cathedral on the left. Now, the tower on the right, as you can see, as often in these churches, the towers are different between the one on the left and the right. The one on the right is called la Tour du Beurre. Tower of Butter that was erected actually in the early 16th century. Really interesting anecdote is that the butter was banned during Lent, and those who did not wish to forego that let's say, indulgence, would donate monies of 6 deniers to the church. And it is with that money that finally they were able to finish that church. So it tells you a lot of people were cheating during Lent. The cathedral burned in 1200 and it was rebuilt now in high Gothic because the style had evolved. And you can see the very heavy ornamentation shows you a style that has evolved from the primary Gothic to what is called the high Gothic style. The portal is absolutely extraordinary. It was very well, I think, portrayed by Monet. We'll see that in a minute. But you can see the intricacy of the sculptures, and the archivolts has that very interesting feature there. And then the gems are rather highly located in the whole series of probably also the kings of the Old Testament, as well as some bishops and popes. In the tympanum of the frontal central portal is the tree of Jesse. And you can see the tree there that traces the descendant of all the way from Jesse to Mary. It's like a lace when you look at it. The work of the stone, the carving of the stone is so delicate, incredible. So the interior is remarkable too. The length of the nave is about 400 feet. The height of the north crossing is 90 feet. And the southern crossing, yeah, about the same. The spire now is very high. It's 450 feet, the central spire. And the arrow, just like it did with Notre Dame, went on fire in 1822. And the tower, Saint-Romain, so the one on the left, went on fire in 1944. As you can imagine, that's part of the end of the Second World War. Claude Monet just loved the cathedral. He rented an apartment across from the western facade. And the story goes that he had installed some easels, many easels there, because as you know, the light changes very quickly. And so he really wanted to express the change of light and how it impacts such a heavily sculpted facade. So you have here, I give you a few examples of the Rouen Cathedral in full sunlight on the left, and at earlier time, or probably slightly clouded sky. There's not only the Rouen Cathedral in Rouen, but also the Church of Saint-Juan that was built a little later in the beginning of the 14th century and all the way to the 15th century. So it also reflects that the highly ornated, high Gothic style. It was originally the abbey church for another Benedictine order, but the whole scheme was interrupted during the 100-Year War. It was sacked and badly damaged during that time. And it was finally completed in the flamboyant style, which is the late Gothic style. It was dedicated at first to St. Peter, and then to Saint Juan, who was the Archbishop of Rouen in the 7th century. As you can see, very high vault, which is a typical characteristic of the High Gothic, which of course emphasizes the height and the light. Look at the size of the windows inside. The west facade, by the way, which is here, was never completed during the Middle Age, and it was only constructed between 1846 and 1851 in a neo-Gothic style. Saint-Maclou Church is another of the great churches and very high steeple that you can admire in Rouen. The construction of it only began after 1435, and it was actually replacing a Romanesque church that existed there. So here you have what you call more of a basilica style church that is not very large, but has received, it's a basilica because it received special privileges from the Pope. It has 4 radiating chapels at the back around an octagonal choir that you can see there. Other beauties you can find in Rouen, the Gros Horloge, the great clock that was admired by Turner when he went by and painted that gouache with the same name. Typical houses of Normandy with the wooden appearing on the facade. La Place du Vieux Marché. And these, what they call half-timbered house. As Joan of Arc is so famous, unfortunately, for being burned at the stake in Rouen, they erected a particular church for her in 1979. And so we have that ultra-modern church dedicated to her. It was completed in 1979 in the center of the ancient market square. So this used to be the Place du Vieux Marché. And there is a small garden that actually marks the exact spot where she was burned. Okay, so I'm going to give you a break now. Take a few minutes, about 5 minutes or so, to stretch your legs, get a cup of coffee. You can actually unmute yourself and ask me questions or just chat. So 5 minutes. You come back around 11 o'clock. Thank you, but don't hesitate to ask me questions or make comments. It's always nice to hear your voices.
Joan has a question.
Oh, hi, Anne.
Yes, hi.
Oh, hi, it's Joan. So in the Saint-Maclou Church, it looked like it was a rounded apse. Is that what we were seeing?
It's an octagonal.
Ah.
So it's
but
almost round. It's almost
that's
round.
The apse. I'm
Pardon?
sorry. I'm sorry I interrupted you. What did you say?
I say it's an octagonal apse, and so it almost looks round, but it's actually, it has faces.
Oh, I see, but that is the apse. That's the sort of
Yeah.
the end of the church. Of the
Yes, that's
facility.
where the
Oh,
altar.
okay.
That's where the altar. The apse is where you have the altar.
Right.
It's the end of the
Oh,
cave,
okay.
and you have the altar. It's the apse. It's called, seen from the outside, they call it the chevet in French also, so where you can see the radiating chapels.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was trying to teach about the Bayeux tapestry in middle school,
Yes.
and this girl started talking about the Bible and King Herod, and I barely had it understood myself, as opposed to King Harold. And oh my God, she thought a light went on and started going off on King Herod in the Bible. Oh my God.
No, it's Harold. Harold.
Right.
Yeah, and then it's not quite
And
the same.
there's some stuff too about the boots and the soldiers and all sorts of minutia about the tapestry.
Yes,
that,
and this is why these are such documents for us, because it shows, and particularly with the Bayeux tapestry, they show, you see the Mont St-Michel. So we have an idea more or less how the Mont St-Michel could have looked at that time, you know, and other specifics. It's just fascinating. But I really like the fact that they finally discovered that it was made in England because of the Latin that was used in the sentences.
very
So
cool.
Latin was different in different areas in Europe. They had developed a Latin that was proper to them. And as Latin was not really we call it a dead language, but though at that time they were using it to talk too. So it's interesting, and it evolved in a different manner. The pronunciation is different too. If you look at classical Latin, it's a much harder sound, but what evolved as what you call the Middle-aged Latin or the Church Latin, it becomes a much softer sound. So you would call Caesar and not Caesar, you see?
That's my only experience with Latin is in the Mass, but my nephew.
Yeah,
is a Greek.
exactly. And so it's very difficult, when you see it. For Caesar, it's Kaiser, and all the C's are hard, but they become soft later on. So that's a difference. And I have the same thing. I studied Latin, but for me the Latin and the pronunciation was what we were saying at church. So
Get some tea.
how are my two Mason sisters there? How are they doing? Joan and Anne, how are you?
Oh, good.
Fine.
We're up in Flagstaff.
Oh, you are terrific.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Very refreshing up here.
though the mornings are okay. This morning it was probably something like 78 on the golf course, because that's where
That's cold.
Yeah. No, that was pretty good.
Yeah.
So
And-
it warms up quickly though. Yes, John.
Just one comment. I was, this whole process is interesting because it shows how much of the European history or the details of European history is captured through art. I mean, this whole panel that you just showed, I mean, the books can explain a lot of things, but they don't give the colorful details of these battles and art. I mean, I'm impressed with how much art is able to capture of this evolution of.
Thank you for saying that, because for me, you see, I'm absolutely fascinated by history, but I think that it is through art history that you can better explain things, because there they are the witness of what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And, I'm preparing a talk that I'm going to give you next year, normally in the summer, which is about Brittany. And that's also absolutely fascinating because they have tremendous, oh, so sorry. They have a lot of megaliths. Somebody knew. So they had a lot, they have, in Brittany, we find tremendous prehistoric monuments. And people always talk about Stonehenge in England, and it with its sheer size, it's remarkable. But you know, you're going to see what I show you in Brittany, and it's mind-boggling to see what they have there. And so, but there is a big link between Brittany and Great Britain, you see. So that's why it's the same civilization that built the same things and went on to do it in northern Portugal.
But one thing is interesting when you talk the Vikings, the routes of the Vikings. So
Yes.
when they arrive in Europe, do they adopt Latin? I mean, what language do they?
Oh no, they were talking what is now, you know, in a different place. They were talking the early Dane for those that were coming from Denmark, and the early Norwegian and early Sweden for the others. They just came and once they settled, came to speak the same language as the others. They Christianized, and so they started speaking the old French, the Languedoc.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So that's, they seem to have, but it took centuries. You know, we always go by and say like this, but it takes centuries. Just like Christianization, it's not something that happened from one day to the other. We have to very well realize that when Christianity started coming to Europe, it lived for a long time side by side with the Roman gods as well as the Gaulish gods. So you had that multiplicity of religion, if you want, that kind of finally was, the Christians were very smart, is that they replaced a lot of the old concept by something that became Christian.
Yeah.
And that's when, you know, we did the Black Virgins. That's so obvious there. The Black Madonnas, how they borrow from the cult of Isis and Horus, because it's the same thing. If you look at these big tympana that we saw in Romanesque church, you see St. Michael with the scale.
Uh-huh.
Where it comes from? It comes from Egypt directly.
Cool. I didn't know that.
It comes from Egypt. It's where they were weighing the souls. That's the same thing.
Yeah.
So that's
Where is
yes.
Where is Chartres geographically located? Is it closer to Paris or is it closer to Normandy?
No, Chartres is west of Paris, going slightly south.
Like how long would it take to get there from Paris?
From Paris, it's about an hour and a half, 2 hours. Once you're out of Paris, yeah.
Hey, Anne?
Yes.
I've seen history shows where the Vikings also were probably in North America before Columbus was. Is
They
that
talk
true?
about Eric the Rouge, Eric le Rouge, so Eric the Red might have been, and they found things on the American coast. The thing is, it never developed and they died out.
Oh, okay.
They either died out or went back, but it never ended up being anything marking. But they found some settlements in quite north.
Right,
But
and like Canada now, right?
Yeah, the Vikings went to Greenland, so it's not a big step.
Oh, right.
Once you're in Greenland, you know, you can go. Okay, I'm gonna go on, so I'm gonna mute you all again, and we can go on talking at the end. Okay, so we're moving to another fascinating city in Normandy. It's Caen. I know it has a strange spelling. It's C-A-E-N, but it's pronounced Caen. And I'm going to, sorry, there we are. Coming from the Celtic Catumagos and the Norman Caem. So there is the change with the Norman language coming from Scandinavia, but they called it Caem, and that's very close to what it is now. I remember visiting Caen that, unfortunately, as you can see by the mostly modern buildings in the center, has been terribly damaged during the Second World War. But my father telling me in Caen there are two churches, is the Abbey of the Men and the Abbey of Women. And so indeed, not too far from one another are two very important churches that were part again of a whole monastic ensemble, and that we have to realize. Most of these churches that are very old, I'm not talking Notre Dame de Chartres, Notre Dame de Paris, but in this case, these were abbey churches that were surrounded by all the monastic buildings and the churches. Finally, a town developed around it, and most of the time, probably during the French Revolution, all the monastic buildings were demolished. So these buildings date back from just after William the Conqueror conquered England. And actually, it is in the Abbey Saint-Pierre that William the Conqueror is buried. The castle that you see on the bottom was built in 1060 by William the Conqueror. The Abbey Saint-Étienne is here, so the Abbey aux Hommes is that beautiful building, and this is really the transition between the Romanesque, and you can see pure Romanesque in the towers, but you can see that the apse again has been rebuilt in Gothic style, with you have the broken arch there. It was founded by Matilda of Flanders, who was the wife of William the Conqueror. It's built in typically that creamy colored stone, which is the Caen stone. It began in 1066, which is the year of the Battle of Hastings, and went on for many decades during the 11th century. The original apse that I mentioned, that was a Romanesque apse, was replaced later on by a early Gothic style chevet. And so you have to realize that once you come to the Gothic style, you can open large windows, and that probably was one of the reasons, is that it made at least that part of the church much lighter. The interior here, you can see, and you can see still the round arch that are the witness of, show that this was a Romanesque church, but then the end comes with a Gothic style, and you can see the ribbed vaults that are showing here the early Gothic. It's still a six-parted, so it's separated in six kind of triangles that bring the weight all along the ribs and down the columns. This is actually apparently where the first time these ribbed vaults were used in France. These two abbeys that you see here, Saint-Étienne and the other one, are the forerunners of the Gothic style. And the tomb of William the Conqueror in the Abbey aux Hommes, with a much later altarpiece, of course. across, it's almost across from the Abbey aux Hommes, you have the Abbey aux Dames, so the Abbey Church for the ladies. And this is the Abbey of Saint Trinity, Holy Trinity, that was founded by Matilda of Flanders. As you can see, that one has a very heavily Romanesque style with the rounded arches for even the main portal and the very sturdy two towers. The tympanum showing actually the three faces of Christ. And of course, surrounded by the tetramorphs, beast of the apocalypse that represents the four evangelists. In Caen, you still have the convent buildings of the Abbey of Dames. That is a much later, of course, building. So this was rebuilt, and it's absolutely the Renaissance, a very classical architecture of the Renaissance, and has been now turned into, was turned into the seat of the regional council of Basse Normandy. As I mentioned, Caen was horribly damaged during the Second World War. This is what was left, and you can see just, it's amazing to see the spires of the church intact and then the rest in terrible shape. Bayeux is the place, of course, where the tapestry is hanging, but it's a beautiful little town. The name comes from Neomagus in Celtic, and sorry for my accent, I was not there in the Celtic time, and Latin Civitas Baiocacensis, and so this is where it takes its name. It's from the Roman side. In the historic center, you have the Notre Dame that you can see the towers there. Again, the city was largely destroyed during the Viking raid, but was rebuilt in the early 10th century. And it also has the privilege of having been the first major town that was secured by the Allies during Operations Overlord, when Charles de Gaulle made his two famous speeches in this town. And we'll see him in a minute. Here's the Bayeux Cathedral. Again, this is a building that was consecrated in 1077, but the building went on all the way to the 15th century, which explains why we have parts of the building in a much more ornated Gothic. You can see how they redid the crowning of the central tower in 1865. So this is a much later part of the church. This is part, by the way, of the whole campaign in 1865, when Prosper Mérimée in France directed under at that time, Napoleon III was directed to make an inventory of all the beautiful buildings in France and try to bring them back to their original beauty. In Bayeux, you can find also a beautiful botanical garden that houses also an extraordinary beach. This is called the Weeping Beach. classified as natural monument in 1932, but goes back probably a few hundred years. The branches cover a surface of 1,250 square meters. So multiply, you see it's about 12,500 square feet. And you can see how they have secured all these branches with an armature, metallic armature. And here's an old picture showing General de Gaulle walking in the street of Bayeux on June 14th, 1944. And you can imagine, to the joy of the population there. So in these speeches, he made clear that France sided with the Allies. What happened is, thanks to that, the buildings in Bayeux were virtually untouched during the Battle of Normandy. The German forces were so much involved in trying to defend Caen that you see were pretty damaged, that Bayeux escaped from that. Though the Bayeux War Cemetery is the largest Second World War cemetery of the Commonwealth soldiers in France. It contains 4,648 burials, mostly of the invasion of Normandy. Across from that one is the Bayeux Memorial, which commemorates more than 1,800 casualties who died in Normandy. We can see all around France, actually, and I've shown you many already, but this is a superb abbey. It's called Abbey of Our Lady of Bec, that was built at first in 10,034. What you see here is the towers, St. Nicholas. It was restored in the 19th century. Now there is a very close contact between this abbey and the Cathedral of Canterbury. There was the last five Archbishop of Canterbury came to visit the Bec. The Bec has an extraordinary library and was really considered as a very important religious center. And so there's always been a very close contact between Canterbury and here. And very often, despite the fact that this is, of course, a Catholic abbey, a lot of the highly thought of, if you want, clerics that were in Canterbury came and studied in the Abbey of Le Bec. This is the south side with the church and the monk's cell. These are pretty cells. And a view of the cloister. So great link with Anglicanism, with the Church of England. And the Tower of St. Nicholas. The church, the abbey is also known now for the potteries that the monks are producing. Here's the view of the Abbey of Le Bec in 1788, which means a year before the Revolution. So what you can see, this is the Tower of St. Nicholas. The church doesn't exist anymore. So because of its strategic location, you can see that there is quite an enormous amount of chateaus. Chateaus that belonged, in red, the one that belonged to the duchy, to the duke, whereas the other one in black belonged to other dukes and aristocrats. This shows the most important chateaus in the 17th century. Of course, many of them have been either left by themselves and just went down, were used as quarry, literally, as we find with many old monuments where people of the villages and the cities around would go and use these stones to build other buildings. One of the main chateaus was the Chateau of Gisors. There is an enormous amount of literature about this because it's supposed to have belonged to the Templars. And a lot of people believe that the treasure of the Templars is located in the Chateau de Gisors. But I know a few chateaus in Spain where they think the same thing. Ponteferrada, for example, is also supposed to have the treasure of the Templar. That was never found, but maybe it was found much earlier and then spent. They had tremendous monies, but as you know, then were condemned by the king, who owed them a lot of money, and the best way for him not to reimburse was to find a way to get rid of them, and then they went burned at the stake in Paris on the Île aux Juifs. Very close to the Chateau Gisors is the famous house of Monet, Claude Monet, in Giverny. And here you have a view of that absolutely wonderful house. And of course, the very celebrated gardens that were planted according to Monet, to the small details. And it's really interesting when we talk about Giverny, is the fact that there is at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the BNF, quite a bit of correspondence of Monet and his gardeners. He was holding, by that time, 4 or 5 gardeners full-time, and was telling them what to plant, where to plant it, and they would rebel, and they would come back to him and say, no, we can't do that. He said, you will do it. I want that spot of red there, because he knew he was going to paint them. So it's a quite entertaining correspondence. The painters from that period, so the pre-impressionist and then the impressionist, came to the coast of Normandy thanks to the development of the railroad. And the railroad that started at the end of June 1842 went all the way to develop at the end of 1860. You can see the network. Had a problem, is that they belonged to 6 different companies and were not interactive. So they all, as you can see, were going to Paris and then were linking Paris to cities like Lyon. But then Lyon had no way to go to Limoges or to Orléans or to Poitiers. So the beginning, that was kind of late compared to other countries in Europe because of the multiple revolutions and communes, as they call it in France. The railway started later than in other countries. But once they did, they really opened a tremendous way for artists and other people and tourists, of course, to go to the coast. And they went to, from, you know, the coast close to Caen all the way to Dieppe, and transformed all these places that were at that time little fishermen villages into what is going to turn to be resort cities. And it's really because of the development of the railways and the advertising often by artists such as Courbet, Monet, Morisot, Corot, etc., that suddenly in Paris, they saw the beauty of the sites and then started coming in loads to the place. And we're going to try to look at it a little bit. So you can see that in Deauville, which, as I say, was a fishing village, fisherman village, particularly in Deauville, we see Courbet, Boudin, and Monet. In Dieppe, Gonzalez, she's a woman, very talented, but is very little talked about. Etretat, Monet particularly, we'll see that. Fécamp, Morisot, Bette Morisot and Monet. Honfleur, Isabey, that's earlier. And Monet, Le Havre, Monet, of course, this is where he grew up. Sainte-Adresse, Corot, Isabey, Yonkind and Monet. And Trouville, Mosin, Stevens, Courbet, Boudin and Monet. This is, as you can see how much it has changed. Finally, in 1860, the government stepped in and said, you know, we have to think logically and we have to make sense of that network. And so by 1880, the network had increased so enormously that France was one of the most advanced by that time country in railroad system. And it still remains, it's a place where you can easily take a train, jump from one place to the other. And they now have, of course, the bullet train, which is fabulous. But this is how the development of the railway had a great influence on the economy, the social side of life, but also on art. So, for example, here is by Charles Mosin, and this is in 1830. You see the little creek that is coming close to the northern coast, and the kind of small houses that the fishermen would live in, and with people just riding mules. And this is close to what Trouville is going to become. In Trouville itself, we see that change, and you can see how very sparse the houses are on the coast. This is by 1888. So this is the beginning of Trouville with some of the marinas. But the interesting image that you have to have is who was living in Trouville? Fishermen and their wives and their families. So they have to reconvert because there come the tourists. As you know, women were not supposed to go around in a bikini on the beach, but they were very thoroughly covered. But to go into the sea, they were staying in these little cabins that were drawn by horses. So they would go into the sea, but they couldn't swim, most of them. So it was these former fishermen that had to take them and give them a feeling. They were carrying them in the water while they were just moving around and giving them a feeling that they were swimming. While the wives, on the other hand, were starting little restaurants so that they could feed all these crowds. Boudin, Eugène Boudin, was one of the two main influences on the early career of Claude Monet. He is the one who is going to tell him, get out of your studio, come and paint on the shores. Try to catch the reality of the moment and catch the light and the atmosphere. So Boudin is really going to be very influential in the young Monet. Why could they do it at that time? It's because early in the century, an American genius literally developed the little painting tubes that were allowing artists to not to have to carry the pigments in little pockets and so on, but be able to take the easel and the canvas and the tubes that were sealed and be able to go on the beach and paint. Here is now the banks of the Touques River in Trouville. So you see how much it has changed. And not only did people come from Paris and from other places in France to enjoy the North Coast, But very quickly, the British people came across the channel and they enjoyed the good food that they could find in France. And so they very often came, and then were the one that changed completely these sites into resorts with casino and places. They wanted places to entertain. So casinos with these operas and so on. Across from Trouville, you have the Sainte-Adresse, which is a small town that Monet really enjoyed. And here's some beaches at Sainte-Adresse. As you can see, there was almost nothing there. And these are two paintings of the other painter that was so influential on the young Monet, is Johann Barthold Jonkind, who is a Dutchman who spent a lot of his career in France. As you can see, was born in 1819, but painted there around 1850. So this is prior to the beginning of the Impressionist movement. This is the painting Port at Étretat, and the other one, Biche at Sainte-Adresse. Jonkind was really known and is extraordinary in his rendering of the skies and the fact how the light can change. As you can see, the way he paints his cloud. And it's a fast, he works also fast as Boudin was. But these two men were the great influence on the young Monet. And by the way, Jonkind was very famous in Paris in his time. He was quite recognized, more than Boudin, who stayed more on the coast. He is one of the very early paintings by Monet, 1866, the garden at Sainte-Adresse, where has that kind of bird's eye view on that terrace here, and then the view at the back of all the ships sailing through the channel. Of course, the love for the flowers, these glads, as you can see, and geraniums and other plants, and then the flags flying in the wind. Here is the regatta at Sainte-Adresse. Also, that's a sport that the British brought to the coast. They were very fond of sailing, and so it is most of them that brought these races and so on to the north. So the north coast of France becomes extremely attractive for the British as well as for the rest of the population. Here's Le Havre, which is the first city of the northern of Normandy, the largest one, and mostly because of its harbor. So you have a picture here of the Le Havre in late 19th century. Of course, this was not the fisherman village. This was an established harbor, and so therefore had a whole life by itself, and had operas and churches, etc., etc. But it is in the city that Claude Monet is going to be raised. His aunt had a kind of a grocery store there, and his parents and him moved to Le Havre for when he was pretty young. Showing some talent very early, Monet was actually living of making caricatures. And you can see at the end of 1850s and in 1860, and he would sell this. He would put that in the window of his aunt, and they were extremely successful. So it's at age 5 that Monet moved to Le Havre. And when he was doing these caricatures with charcoal, showing the fact that he was pretty talented, he actually even mentions that at 15, I was known all over Le Havre as a caricaturist. My reputation was so well established that from all sides, people came to me and pestered me for caricatures. I had so many requests, and the pocket money my mother could spare me was so meager that I was led to take a bold step, one which, needless to say, shocked my parents. I started selling my portraits. Sizing up my customer, I charged 10 or 20 francs a caricature, and it worked like a charm. And then he thought at that time he was going to become a millionaire, which is really cute because we know how much he struggled early on. And it is Le Havre that he represents in that first painting that is exhibited at that first Impressionist hanging in the studio of Nada, the photographer Nada, that had lent them the space. A group of young painters decide to hang their paintings in a completely new style. And this is one of the paintings that Monet hung. It's called Impression Soleil Levant, Impression Sunrise. And it actually shows the harbor of Le Havre in the background. There were about 7 or 8 painters at that time in that space, and this was a very informal hanging. And so one of the critiques of the time came through the exhibition, and the day after wrote in the paper, these people who called themselves impressionists because of the Impression Sunrise. And this is that painting that gave the name to the movement of Impressionism. You can see how very quickly painted it is, but he comes around in giving you that sense of that early sun with that kind of haze, as it is pretty humid there. And so for the people at that time, these paintings were not finished. Nobody was painting that way at the time. That's another painting of Le Havre, this time by Camille Pissarro. Camille Pissarro, considered the father of the Impressionists. He was the father figure. He was helping many of them that were struggling for money, and had that also quick brush. He's going to move to Pointillisme for a while, but was quite a nice personality. Because of its strategic location, Le Havre is unfortunately going to suffer tremendously from the Second World War, and this is a view of Le Havre during winter 1944-1945. And now the skyline in 2005. So you've seen this change, but this is why Le Havre doesn't have much anything that dates back to Francis I period, where it really became an important harbor. This is the interior of the University of Le Havre library. As you can see, a very beautiful modern architecture. Another painting of Trouville, and this shows one of the great hotels that still exists, by the way, Hôtel des Roches Noires in Trouville, and shows you how very quickly these resorts grew out of fishermen villages. Not too far from Trouville is the beautiful location of Étretat. Étretat, very famous for its cliffs, and particularly this one. It is called the Manneporte, and we see where has been a motif for a theme, let's say, for paintings from Gustave Courbet that you see here to Monet with the Manneporte and the beautiful reflection of the different colors due to the waves on the stone of the Manneporte. Étretat has been a point of attraction since the early 19th century, particularly for the beauty of its cliffs. Here is actually a picture of it. You can see how impressive it is. In Deauville, just across from Trouville, Deauville has grown to be a tremendous resort with casinos and anything that can entertain you. And you can see that at the time, a lot of the stars from Hollywood came by and had their own little cabins where they could change when they were along the sea. You can see these are along there in beautiful sand beach. It is called the Promenade des Planches, so where the closets were dedicated to famous actors that had come there. And here's the casino. The Hotel Normandy in Deauville is one of these very famous hotels, known for its beautiful gardens too. Another of the seaside place is Cherbourg, also a harbor, so didn't quite evolve only from a fisherman village. Had, as you can was already used as a harbor for many centuries. And this is taken at the occasion of the tall ships race in 2005. Cherbourg was also, as you can imagine, damaged during the war. And here's a picture of American soldiers engaged in the street fighting. Around that Presqu'île of the Cotentin, you have also a whole series of islands. These are the Chaussée Islands, and you have a whole series there. This is where we saw the cromlech earlier. And all these islands give you a chance for beautiful landscapes, such as this one. And the castle on the Grand Isle of Chaussée Islands. And of course, that coast, as you know, particularly for Americans, I think, and for Canadians, is known for the role it played during at the end of the Second World War. So I'm bringing you a map that shows you how, so we were just looking at these Chaussée Islands that were here. But you can see the map of all the attacks that took place that famous day of the invasion on the 6th June of 1944, which is still for me mind-boggling how they were able to do that. And I'm always thinking of these young soldiers on these ships, not knowing if they were ever going to come out of there. So you can see, for those of you that are familiar with all these names, you have the gold and Juno and the sword and Omaha Beach, the famous Omaha Beach, and Utah. And the pictures that we've all seen of that D-Day invasion. There are some remnants of these, and as a child, even in Belgium, I could see these bunkers that are lining the coast. So with still some of these large guns used by the Germans. This is Arromanches Mulberry Harbor, where you can still see some of the ships. And places like Saint-Lô after US bombing in July 1944, when nothing was left, but this was a railroad and it was strategic. And of course, the cemeteries. This is the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial that contains over 9,000 burials. And these are all memory places. You've seen them in Belgium. The Second World War and the first one actually are very difficult to forget. And I think for the period that we live right now, which is a difficult period, but we have to think of what these people went through, or even the inhabitants, when you see how the cities were raised at the time of the comeback of the Allies. So I hope when you see Normandy, we can also talk about the beauty of the costume that the ladies used to wear. And of course, when we're in France, we have to talk about food. And food, the marvelous cheeses, Camembert, Livarot, and Calvados, Pont-l'Évêque. These are some of the great names of cheeses. You can find that Camembert for sure. And then you have the cider, very known there, and the Calvados. Calvados is an alcohol that is pretty strong. But after a good meal, you just kind of digest by having just a little shot of calva, as they say, good calva. Recipes, coquille Saint-Jacques, the scallop shells. Tripe à la mode de Caen is baked tripes with calvados. And for dessert, of course, the crepes. The crepes Normandes are really the specialty. You find crepes in Normandy, and you find them in Brittany, where they use it both savory and sweet. And then the turgoule, which is a rice pudding that is a specialty of Normandy. So we've seen sad images and hopefully some pretty images. Next time we will do a rerun of the Massif Central, which is the heart and lungs of France. Very completely different landscape, but beautiful and probably pretty serene, I would say. So I'm now going to open let me just stop the recording.